if you are renting, you don't own the house, so you are now dependent upon the owner of the house to make sure that they're actually fixing things up and taking care of any repairs or maintenance that needs to be done. And so you want to make sure you're doing some research on your potential landlord, just using a quick Google search of their name, going to the local judicial website, putting their name in. These are easy checks that you can perform to see if anything comes up.
Are you ready for a successful retirement? We're addressing the topics facing today's retirees. Welcome to Retire with Ryan. Now here's your host, Ryan Morrissey.
Welcome back. This week I'm addressing another listener question, and this listener, Debbie, wrote in that she was interested in knowing about renting versus owning in retirement. What are some of the trade-offs, whether there could be savings and taxes, etc. So on this week's episode, that's what I'm going to address. And specifically, should you sell your home and rent in retirement? And I have my own opinions about this, but I did a little bit of research, reading different articles, trying to get some other opinions, and I'll share a link in the show notes to a few articles that I found. And now more than ever, I think this is a strong consideration because had I recorded this a year ago, selling a house where I am in Connecticut, there wouldn't have been a tremendous advantage because the real estate market hadn't really done a whole lot. But in the last 6 months, I would say, and this is even across the entire country, the value of real estate has gone up a tremendous amount, 10 to 20%, even more. I was talking to one client who retired on the west coast of Florida, and he closed on his house not even a year ago, and he paid about $500,000 for it, and now that house today is worth $800,000. So that's a tremendous increase. And so I think it comes down to a number of factors regarding this, whether it makes sense now to sell your house and rent. So the first thing would be, what are your goals? And more specifically, what are your retirement goals? If you're someone who is looking to stay in your area where you are now, then it could be worth considering selling your house and staying where you are. Or if you're looking to move, it could give you a lot more flexibility by moving because you can try out a new area. You could sign a 1-year lease somewhere, see if you like it. If you do, you could extend your lease, move somewhere else, but it really gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to move around, especially if you have children and you have grandchildren, you're looking to spend more time with them, especially if they don't live close to you. You have the ability to then move and be closer to them, or even if they end up moving, right? I've had clients who have relocated to be closer to their grandchildren, and then their children have a change in job and they have to move, and now the grandparent has to move as well. And that can be challenging, especially if now you're having to sell your house and move again. So that's an advantage. You do have to definitely weigh, though, the emotional side of renting versus owning. For whatever reason, for a lot of people, it's perceived that, renting isn't a smart decision, that, it has certain stigmas. And really, I think at this point, it's really about what best fits with what you're looking for, but also from the financial aspect. But if you are renting, you don't own the house, so you are now dependent upon the owner of the house to make sure that they're actually fixing things up and taking care of any repairs or maintenance that needs to be done. And so you want to make sure you're doing some research on your potential landlord, just using a quick Google search of their name, going to the local judicial website, putting their name in. These are easy checks that you can perform to see if anything comes up. If you see their name in a number of lawsuits, maybe involving other tenants, then you may want to stay away from them. If you're going to be renting in an apartment building or from a larger landlord, that is an easier task because you could also put in their name. Thanks to Google and a lot of other review sites, you probably could see different reviews. And unfortunately, a lot of reviews that you do see are negative, so you have to weigh that in your decision. But all this kind of factors in. And you also have to think about the fact that there could be some instability with renting because most leases are usually a year long. You could sign a longer lease than that, and your landlord at the end of your lease could change their mind about re-renting to you. Maybe they want to sell the house, or maybe they want to rent it to someone else, move in themselves. So that's definitely another factor as well. There could be some more changes with renting versus owning, where you might have to renew your lease more often and move. But I can tell you, I've talked about in past episodes that I am a landlord myself. And as a landlord, you're really looking for a tenant to stay there a long time. Any landlord that has turnover knows that there's cost involved in that. You have to paint the apartment, possibly replace carpet, make any repairs that the tenant never notified you about. And you also then have possible lost rent if the apartment's vacant. And you also have the cost of hiring someone to rent it out for you if you're using a rental agent. And all those costs add up. So most landlords, I think, are looking for someone to stay there a while and pay the rent on time and take care of the property. So if you're doing those things, I think for the most part, you shouldn't have a lot of change. And one other thing too that I mentioned is that you don't have the cost of fixing as much. You don't have the cost because now your landlord's responsible for fixing things when they break. In one of these articles that I found from the New York Times, a number was thrown out there, a statistic that close to 80% of people 65 and older own their own homes, which is not surprising, but renting is on the rise among older people. And according to a website, Rent Cafe, the number of renter households where their primary resident was 60 or older grew 43% from 2007 to 2017. And in certain cities, such as Austin, rent is up 113%. Phoenix, Fort Worth, Jacksonville, and even New York, renters have grown despite, what's been going on there. So the next thing to consider is, what is your time frame? And most experts say that the longer you plan to stay somewhere, the more it can make sense to actually own a house versus rent. And there's different numbers that are used, but usually if you're looking to stay somewhere less than 5 years, renting is probably a better choice. If you're looking to stay somewhere more than 5 years, then owning can be a better choice. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that because everyone's situation is different. And when I get into one of my next points, I think you'll see where I'm coming with that. But you do lose out on the ability of any appreciation that you would get by owning a house, right? If you own a house and the real estate market goes up in price, then your house will go up in price as well. But if you took that money and you invested it somewhere else, presumably in a diversified stock and bond portfolio, the chances are actually that you could have more appreciation, because historically, when you look at the growth in real estate prices, it has been about half of what the return in the stock market has been. This is assuming your house is paid off. If you have a larger mortgage, then you could benefit from the leverage that you get by having a mortgage as far as the appreciation. Now, if you're invested more in stocks, you're now undertaking more volatility because stocks do fluctuate in price probably more than real estate does, but it gives you more potential for appreciation. So I'm not certain I agree with that. And the point that I mentioned earlier about the fact that you don't have any maintenance costs as a renter, whereas if you own a house or even owning a condo, you have to pay condo fees, you have to pay assessments. When you own a house, if your roof has a leak in it and you need to replace your roof, or your heating and cooling mechanicals go bad, or there's a leak, right? These are all things that you have to pay for, whereas a renter, you wouldn't pay for them. Another thing to consider, obviously, too, is wherever you move, you want to consider what the other amenities are, as far as what are the hospitals and medical facilities like in your area? What are the cultural offerings, other features? You could look at this renting period also as a temporary thing. Maybe for the first 5 or 10 years of your retirement, if you're going to be more active, doing more traveling, you could be renting and significantly cut your cost. If you're renting a small apartment versus owning a large house, that could really save you a lot of money. And you could live in a more urban setting. I know that is a desire sometimes for people to move in an urban setting where they can walk to more things, where there's more restaurants, museums, parks. Whereas, when you're living in a suburban area, you don't sometimes have as much interaction. Next thing to think about is, how liquid do you want to be in retirement? Do you want more liquidity? And what I mean by that is that when you have a house and it's paid off, it's a great thing. I encourage people, if it makes sense, to try to become debt-free going into retirement. But now that you have this house paid off, you have this asset that is not generating any income for you, right? And it also is costing you money. Every house has annual taxes, annual liability insurance, whatever your maintenance costs are for mowing your lawn, having the snow shoveled, and then, upkeep, having your furnace serviced, right? Anything like that. So you'd want to figure out what that number is. And let's just say that that number for you was $1,000 a month, and you could sell your house today for $500,000. So I would say most people that sell their house are going to pay some closing costs of about like 5 or 6% to sell their house. So let's just say that you sold your house for $500,000 and you paid 6% in closing costs between realtor fees and other transfer fees, and you walked away with $470,000. If you invested that in a diversified stock and bond portfolio, probably like 60 to 65% in stocks, based on past historical rates of return, you could take out, if you were retiring in your mid-60s, say 5% a year of that portfolio. So that's $23,500 a year you're now getting of income from this money that was invested in your house. And let's just say you could go and you could rent an apartment or a condominium that gave you everything that you needed, maybe a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment or condominium, and that was costing you $2,000 a month. Well, now you're actually positive $13,500. So how am I doing that math? Well, if you stayed in your house, you were paying $1,000 a month to live there. By selling it and reinvesting that money, you're receiving $23,500, which means you're now ahead $13,500 per year. The other way you could look at it is that you sold your house and the money that you took from that, you invested, and that is paying your rent. And now you're living completely rent-free, whereas before it was costing you $1,000 a month. And you still have that money and you have the potential appreciation of that money. So that's a definite benefit where renting can make sense by selling your house and taking the proceeds, investing it, and renting. Now, the other option is that you could downsize, and I would say downsizing is more challenging depending on where you live. Even buying smaller condominiums, I find where I'm in Connecticut, can end up costing you $300,000, $400,000. And now you're paying condominium fees and you're still paying taxes. And that might end up being almost the same amount of money that you were paying to live in your other house. And now you have less maintenance because you have stuff covered by the association, but usually have less space. And you also have the potential for any condominium increases down the road. So you really have to balance that out. You also should think about changes in tax laws, and the Tax Act that was passed in 2017 severely limited in high tax states where I am, such as Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, the ability for people to deduct their state and local taxes that one's paying for property tax, income tax. So what that meant is that for most people now, they're only able to take the standard deduction, which for a married couple is $25,100, and then an additional $1,350 if you're over 65. And for a single filer, it's half of the married couple deduction, which is $12,550. If you're in a house that has relatively high taxes, you are not being able to deduct all these taxes as you were previously. So you could actually be losing money looking at your tax return today versus 3 or 4 years ago. So that's another thing that you could get out from underneath by renting, because now it's your landlord's problem that they're limited to how much they can deduct on their taxes, whereas you're just have your out-of-pocket costs for renting. So that's another thing that could help you as well. So the final thing to think about is what the numbers say. And to help with this decision, I always think it's probably a good idea to sit down with a financial planner who can help you review the pros and cons of these options. But you want to do some research on your own, as I mentioned before, figuring out first, what is it costing you to stay in your house? How much are you spending per year on maintenance? What is the possibility of deferred maintenance that you haven't done that you might have to do? And then start to do some research about if you were to rent in your local area, what would that look like? And some good websites to go to. One is Craigslist. Craigslist can be a great place to go and look for apartments for rent. And you can do an easy search there to see what's available. You could do that for where you live, or if maybe you're thinking of moving somewhere else, you could do that also. One of the articles that I'm going to share a link to is a New York Times article that has a buy versus rent calculator. You will need to sign up for a New York Times account, but you can do it without having to pay anything. You can just sign up for a free account, which I did, and then you can go in there and you can play around with the calculator. It's kind of interesting because you can put in different tax rates and different costs for where you're going to live, and then it can help you to look at what the numbers are of renting versus buying. I should say also that when you do rent, you also might have some costs with renting as far as a security deposit credit and background checks. So there could be some minor costs as well with that. I hope this helps give you some good information about if now is a good time for you to sell your house and rent in retirement. As always, I greatly appreciate any listener questions that you might have. To send me a listener question to consider for a future episode, you can go to retirewithryan.com, and on the contact form, you can put in your listener question, and that will be considered for a future episode. Have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you next Wednesday. Take care.
You should consult a financial advisor familiar with your specific circumstances before you make any financial decisions. Nothing in this broadcast constitutes a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mention of rates of return are historical or hypothetical in nature and are not a guarantee of future returns. Ryan Morrissey, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Morrissey Wealth Management, LLC, a registered investment advisor.